Hello, I'm Peter Herbert, and welcome to this month's short CPD webinar looking at topical aspects of accounting and audit. This month, we're going to look at the revised ICAEW Code of Ethics and what that means in practice. The code has been published recently and applies from the 1st of July 2025. I think, in a sense, a lot of the aspects are really common sense, although I think these are definitely improvements compared to the previous code. And I guess the key highlights to be aware of in terms of the new code. First of all, it does reflect revisions recently made to the IESPA code, so the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants Code. And therefore, whichever professional body you remember of, I think there's some really good stuff there, which is well worth thinking about and adhering to. It puts more focus on public interest, so making sure that accountants, in terms of the ethical behaviours, do think about the broader public interest. I think that probably has historically been something we've framed very sort of front and central as far as audit's concerned. It's now, I think, more front and central as far as the role of accountants more generally is concerned. Enhanced fundamental principles, we'll come on to that shortly. So without changing the fundamental principles, it does fine-tune them and enhance them slightly. And there's some interesting aspects there that we'll explore in this short session today. Thinks about the obligations of accountants in terms of professional and private life, and that, I suppose, links in quite well to this whole public interest responsibility. For sure, there is greater onus on accountants and greater focus on the way they behave in their professional life. But if outside of work they're not on point in terms of the way that they behave, that can again be quite impactful in terms of the perception of professional bodies from a regulatory point of view. Much more focus on professional skepticism and an inquiring mind. Again, that's something we've always thought about, isn't it? A lot from the point of view of audit, but that is now front and central from the point of view of the way that accountants need to behave more generally. And as we'll see, one of the key things that's very much front and central as far as the revised code is concerned is specifically ideas around technology-related revisions. And I suppose the danger can sometimes be that we perhaps are too quick to defer and trust technology that we use day to day without being appropriately skeptical and inquiring in terms of the way that we actually act. So I think professional judgment and professional skepticism are more and more important considerations for accountants in this increasingly technological age in which we work. Okay, so it gives you a broad overview of the sort of new changes. What I'm going to do is just drill down into one or two areas that I think are particularly interesting to people and maybe well worth your consideration on a day-to-day basis. First of all, the fundamental principles, which I said on the previous slide, we are slightly tweaking without changing them fundamentally. So it's always been, hasn't it, the all-important five. So integrity, objectivity, professional competence, confidentiality, and professional behaviour. One aspect, I think, which I think is a very appropriate change in relation to integrity, is to require accountants to have strength of character to act appropriately, even when facing pressure to do otherwise. I've long felt that of the various threats to independence and threats to good ethical outcomes which face accountants, which perhaps we sometimes don't make enough of a play of on the training courses that we run, is the issue of intimidation. And I think that's certainly front and central in terms of the need for that strength of character, and that sort of development of that integrity aspect, I think, is really appropriate. The objectivity one incorporates more reference to bias. That links, of course, back to the whole idea about professional skepticism. And what the revised code does, it makes reference to a number of different types of bias that might impact accountants in the way they work day to day. Notably automation bias that we'll come on to shortly, and also the important bias around confirmation bias. And I guess my thought's always been that in terms of doing the right things by our clients, sometimes we can be perhaps too quick to jump to the conclusion that what they're advocating is very much the right thing to do. It's sometimes about digging in, and I guess being alive to those biases that can impact on us day to day can be quite useful in that regard. Technology developments I mentioned already, and we'll come back to in a few minutes' time. And yes, in terms of that whole professional behaviour aspect, it's that responsibility to act in the public interest that's much more at the core of the revised code than it was compared to the previous one. Let's just drill down for a second on integrity. That I think I've always felt has been a really key one. And I think about situations where perhaps accountants are, facing regulatory sanction from whatever professional body. I've always felt that when there's a perceived lack of integrity, I think regulators do take a pretty dim view. So a couple of points to make, I suppose, in that regard. That point about strength of character, this is an example which I've used quite a lot on the ethics update courses that I've run this year. It's based on the sort of scenario that we regularly come across when talking to firms, particularly on a day-to-day basis. So you've taken on a new client, they're adopting an accounting treatment that you feel is wrong, they're being awkward, you're nervous because their previous accountant was a top 10 firm and their FD has a good knowledge of accounting standards. Now, with this particular example, I think there are various important considerations, I guess, in terms of marshalling your facts to make sure that you're on the right track before you do dig in. But once you have got that sort of understanding that you're quite clear on what your position is, this one is really all about making sure that you do dig in. And yes, that links very well, I think, to that whole strength of character point we mentioned there in terms of that update and that finessing of that integrity aspect of the fundamental principle. Sometimes we're intimidated, sometimes we're backed into a corner, but sometimes it's about sort of standing firm. And I guess in terms of firms and perhaps the challenges which more junior colleagues face, what are more senior members of the firm doing to support the more junior colleagues to make sure that they can indeed also be supported in a situation where they're perhaps being in some way, shape or form intimidated or being backed into a corner. I mentioned that integrity is very front and central as far as the way that regulators see things. And this is certainly a case which caught my eye, not a sort of a professional body sanction, but a Financial Reporting Council sanction for this BDO auditor who was basically forging signatures and electronically signing documents without the people whose signatures were being used being aware of it, notably audit reports. So yeah, clear lack of integrity there. And this particular person was quite heavily sanctioned, as you can see from that slide. So lack of integrity, yeah, regulators do indeed take a very dim view when that comes to light and is proven. I think in terms of developing the revised standards, the revised code, I think a lot of thought was put into professional behavior and what that actually looks like and what that means. And I think, yeah, I suppose things I've highlighted on this sort of slide, making sure that we treat others fairly with respect and dignity, and do not, for example, bully, harass, victimize, or unfairly discriminate against others. Those are specific bits of detail that have been incorporated. I think from the point of view of the way that firms and organizations run day to day, we're always very keen to encourage firms to think about appropriate whistleblowing policies. I guess more than ever now, in the light of the fact that that whole professional behavior aspect has been beefed up and some of those inappropriate behaviors have particularly been referenced in that paragraph 115.1A2 of the revised standard. The final thing I wanted to mention is some of these technology related provisions. I think this is quite an interesting development. A lot of the stuff here is conceptual, but I think very, very appropriate to actually bring in some of these changes, I guess, particularly in the light of the increased developments and use of technology by firms in recent times. And of course, within that, the all-important development in the use of artificial intelligence or AI. So what specific things do the revised provisions make reference to? Well, these are themselves based on the IESPA code, the International Ethics Standards Board for Accountants, making sure that accountants in whatever context are mindful of the risk of automation bias, assuming that because some sort of computer program has sort of developed a particular solution or particular figure, the temptation could be to assume that that's right. So again, just being alive to that risk, and that all links again, doesn't it, to the inquiring mind and being appropriately skeptical. Understanding technology, that's the firm's technology and the client's technology. Obviously, if technology is going to be used to get outcomes for clients, we've got to make sure that everyone in the team that's using that technology is on board and understanding in order for that technology to be used in an appropriate way. And I suppose from a learning and development point of view, there's some important considerations there as well. From the point of view of artificial intelligence, obviously AI provides brilliant opportunities to firms, but it's very much about being mindful of the risks as well as the opportunities that AI presents. And depending on the way that AI tools are utilized, it can just sometimes be plain wrong. That I think sometimes is referred to as AI hallucination. So being at least alive to the risk of that day to day, very important. Linked to that, if we are in a situation where we're using technology, to get outcomes for clients, perhaps certainly if we're using client information within various tools that we're using, making sure that we have sought appropriate consent. We've made clear in letters of engagement the way that technology is being used. And that, I suppose, does link, doesn't it, very much to the risks around confidentiality breaches in relation to the way that firms might use artificial intelligence or AI. Where we've got very complex systems that we're using in any number of contexts, do we need to consult to make sure that we really understand those complex systems and we're using them in the appropriate way to get the good outcomes for clients? That again comes back, doesn't it, to the whole idea about being appropriately skeptical and forming appropriate professional judgments, not being too tempted to be drawn into automation bias. And if we're developing outcomes, developing technology for use by clients in whatever context, it's being alive to the fact that there can be a self-review threat that creates. Are we therefore ensuring day to day that that self-review threat is appropriately addressed? Okay, so nothing that doesn't sound particularly worrying there. I suppose it's just really bringing the code up to date, isn't it, to reflect the new technological age in which we operate. Got a really interesting soundbite from a speech I was reading from ICW President Mark Rees earlier this year in the light of the Mr. Batesby post office scenario or saga. And yeah, it illustrates what can happen when an IT system turns the other side of phantom sales transactions into life-changing debts owed by sub-postmasters. Hopefully, the new code to a point will deal with some of the issues there by, I suppose, at least making candidates alive to the risks that use of technology presents in whatever context on a day-to-day basis. Okay, well, that was useful. If you've got any questions or queries about today's session, do feel free to drop us a note. Inquiries@insight-training.co.uk. We will be talking in a bit more detail about the new code in our practice assurance update, which is running in mid-June of 2025. So do have a look for that course and all our other courses that we're running on our public program on our website, www.insight-training.co.uk. Okay, hope that was useful. Speak to you all again soon. Thank you.